India loves to call itself a rising superpower. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. India barely outperforms Sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region in the world, and in some key areas it actually performs worse. That's not a superpower, that's a delusion wrapped in a chapati. Let's get straight into it. Open any Indian news outlet or scroll through social media, and you'll see a flood of nationalism and delusion. Comments like, world's biggest democracy, fifth largest economy, space power, tech hub, Viksit Bharat, make in India. You'd think India's knocking on the door of the G7 or that they're about to overtake China. But pull back the curtain for a second, and the numbers tell a completely different story. Because while Indian netizens are busy photoshopping Modi onto tanks and rockets, proclaiming victory over Pakistan, millions of their fellow citizens are still defecating in the open due to not having the basic access to toilets. Now let's compare that to Sub-Saharan Africa, a region full of contradictions, conflicts, and a very low baseline. It's a part of the world that has suffered centuries of colonization, slavery, civil wars, and brutal foreign exploitation. It doesn't have a shared language, culture, or even a unified political system. And yet, Sub-Saharan Africa's average person is better off than the average Indian in some crucial ways. Let's start with the basics. Income. According to the World Bank, the gross national income, GNI, per capita in India is around $2,400 as of 2023. Meanwhile, Sub-Saharan Africa's GNI per capita is around $2,500. Let that sink in. The self-proclaimed next superpower earns less per person than the most underdeveloped region on the planet. If you use different sources, they may say that India is slightly ahead of Sub-Saharan Africa, but the point still stands that they are both very close. And this is not a one-off. India has been trailing or barely ahead of Sub-Saharan Africa in this metric for years. And when you adjust for purchasing power parity, which takes into account local prices and cost of living, India does catch up a bit, but still remains dangerously close to the bottom. And here's where it gets worse. Inequality. India has one of the most unequal economies on Earth. According to Oxfam, the top 1% of Indians own more than 40% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50%, that's over 700 million people by the way, own just 3%. So while the Ambanis and Adanis build sky palaces with 27 floors, rural families are still cooking over firewood and dying from preventable diseases. In contrast, Sub-Saharan Africa, while still unequal, isn't as extreme. And that means that in real terms, the average African may actually live a slightly better life than the average Indian. Now let's talk poverty. India likes to brag about lifting millions out of poverty. It's one of Modi's key talking points. And yes, the poverty rate has technically dropped. But it's worth looking at what that actually means. India uses a very low poverty line, about $2 a day, and even then, the country has over 228 million people living below that line. That's the highest absolute number of poor people anywhere on Earth. Meanwhile, Sub-Saharan Africa has more countries with extreme poverty, yes, but its population is about 150 million people less than that of India. I won't sugarcoat it. Proportionally speaking, both regions are doing terribly. But the fact that India, with all its tech hubs and call centers and billionaires, is still in the same league as war-torn, fragmented Sub-Saharan Africa is the real embarrassment. It's not even a single, unified country like India, yet is still on par. What about education, you ask? Well, India likes to advertise its IITs and engineering talent. But here's the thing. Most Indians will never even finish school. The average Indian completes just 6.5 years of schooling. That's less than Ethiopia. Yes, Ethiopia. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the regional average is 6.8 years. And that's despite all the war, famine, and political instability. What's more disturbing is that learning outcomes in India are shockingly low. A government survey in 2023 showed that nearly 70% of rural 14-year-olds couldn't do basic division. In Sub-Saharan Africa, things aren't great either, but the expectations are lower and progress is happening. Countries like Rwanda and Ghana are investing heavily in early childhood education. India, on the other hand, is too busy changing textbooks to suit its nationalist narrative instead of actually teaching kids how to think. Who needs to do basic maths when you can change the history of China crushing India at Aksai Chin? And healthcare? Well, India's healthcare system is a disaster unless you're rich. According to the Global Burden of Disease study, India ranks 145 out of 195 in healthcare access and quality. Sub-Saharan Africa, again, isn't great, but some of its countries, like Kenya and Botswana, are actually making faster progress in reducing child mortality and improving vaccination rates than India. In fact, India has one of the highest child malnutrition rates in the world. About 1 in 3 Indian children is stunted. That's not just bad parenting, that's systemic failure. Let's briefly mention the Human Development Index, a composite measure of life expectancy, education, and income. India ranks 134th. That's lower than Gabon, Ghana, Namibia, and even Congo. Yes, Congo. A country that has seen multiple civil wars in recent times still outperforms India in human development. You can spin GDP all you want, but you can't spin that. Here's the big kicker. Sub-Saharan Africa is not a country. It's a fragmented region with over 40 countries, each with their own governments, problems, and conflicts. It's not unified by language, religion, or governance. India, on the other hand, is a single country with a central government, a shared constitution, and a somewhat common identity. And yet the gap between the two is razor thin. That alone should be a national shame. But instead of facing this, Indian netizens get triggered by any criticism. They flood Twitter and YouTube comments with "jealous of India," "Modi will fix it," "India 2047. They act like pointing out poverty is an attack on the nation. But pretending to be a superpower while half the country doesn't have access to clean toilets isn't patriotism. It's denial. Why would anyone be jealous of a country full of dusty, pothole-riddled roads with cows and beggars on every street corner, mountains of litter, open-flowing sewage and human waste, pollution levels that make Chernobyl blush, gang attacks on tourists, and many other problems? Even on gender equality, India is failing. According to the World Economic Forum's 2024 Global Gender Gap Report, India ranks 129th out of 146 countries. Sub-Saharan African countries like Rwanda, 5th, Namibia, 8th, and South Africa, 18th, all perform dramatically better. How is it that a country with more female goddesses than perhaps any other is one of the worst places on earth to be a woman? And let's not even get started on climate vulnerability, urban slums, caste discrimination, or religious violence. India might have democratic elections, but what good is democracy if you're voting between the same corrupt dynasties or right-wing populists while your kids die from diarrhea? Here's what makes it worse. India has everything it needs to do better. It has fertile land, a huge labor force, a rich cultural history, nuclear weapons, satellites, a strong IT sector. And yet it squanders all that potential because of incompetence, corruption, and arrogance. Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't pretend to be a superpower. India does, and that makes India's failures even more pathetic. Let me be very clear. This isn't about mocking poverty. This isn't about saying Sub-Saharan Africa is better or worse, but it's about holding up a mirror to India. And if India, with all its centralized power, resources, and self-proclaimed global ambitions, can barely keep up with a region shattered by centuries of trauma, then maybe it's time to stop bragging and start fixing. So the next time you hear someone shout, "India is the next China," or "superpower in the making," ask them, what kind of superpower ranks below war-torn African countries in education, income, and healthcare? Because if this is what a rising India looks like, maybe it's time to stop rising and start waking up. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that subscribe button. We've got more uncomfortable truths coming your way.